In the quiet hours before dawn, long before emails, metadata, or digital surveillance, the United States government began a secret war against its own citizens. There were no public declarations, no official battlefields, and no visible enemy lines. Yet the consequences would ripple through decades of American political life, leaving scars that are still debated today. This story does not begin with explosions or armed conflict. It begins with paperwork, with memoranda stamped confidential, with agents instructed not to observe but to disrupt, not to investigate crimes but to prevent movements. The program would later be known as COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. From 1956 to 1971, COINTELPRO operated largely in the shadows, targeting political organizations deemed subversive. Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, socialist groups, black liberation movements, and even feminist organizations would find themselves under scrutiny, not because of proven criminal acts, but because of perceived ideological threats. For years, the American public remained unaware. Mainstream media largely echoed official narratives of national security and communist containment. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, federal agencies tested the boundaries of legality, ethics, and democracy itself. This video explores how COINTELPRO came into existence, why it expanded, how it operated, and how it was ultimately exposed. It is not a story of villains and heroes alone, but of fear, power, secrecy, and the fragile balance between security and liberty. To understand COINTELPRO, we must return to the atmosphere that gave birth to it, a time when ideology was treated as a weapon and dissent was often mistaken for disloyalty. In the mid-1950s, the United States stood at a crossroads of confidence and paranoia. World War II had ended with American dominance, but a new conflict loomed, one without front lines or ceasefires. The Cold War transformed political ideology into a perceived existential threat, and nowhere was this fear more pronounced than within the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had already spent decades monitoring political radicals. Hoover believed deeply that communism was not merely a foreign ideology, but an internal infection, one that could erode American institutions from within. In his view, dissent and subversion were often indistinguishable. COINTELPRO officially began in 1956, initially targeting the Communist Party USA. Internal FBI documents described the program's purpose as actions designed to disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize targeted groups. The language was deliberate. These were not investigations meant to gather evidence for prosecution, but operations meant to weaken movements themselves. At the time, much of the public supported aggressive anti-communist policies. Media coverage reinforced narratives of infiltration and espionage, frequently portraying leftist ideology as inherently dangerous. Senate hearings and loyalty tests created an environment where suspicion was normalized and civil liberties were often secondary. Hoover's FBI viewed itself as a last line of defense. In a 1958 memo, he warned that political movements could gain respectability and influence public opinion if not actively suppressed. This fear of legitimacy would become central to COINTELPRO's expansion. The program relied heavily on secrecy. Agents were instructed that these operations must never be revealed, even to courts or Congress. The success of COINTELPRO depended on plausible deniability, actions designed to look like internal conflict, personal scandal, or spontaneous failure. As the Cold War intensified, so did the scope of surveillance. What began as monitoring communists soon broadened into something far more expansive. The definition of subversive became elastic, shaped by ideology rather than behavior. This was not merely a product of one man's paranoia, but of a political culture shaped by fear. Fear that dissent could unravel national unity, and fear that allowing criticism itself was a form of weakness. In the 1960s, the United States entered a period of profound social transformation. The civil rights movement challenged centuries of racial inequality, while anti-war protests questioned America's role abroad. For many citizens, these movements represented progress. For COINTELPRO, they represented danger. The FBI increasingly viewed civil rights organizations as potential threats to internal security. This was especially true when movements demonstrated the ability to mobilize large numbers of people. Influence, not violence, became the central concern. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of COINTELPRO's most prominent targets. Despite his public commitment to nonviolence, internal FBI communications described him as a destabilizing figure. Surveillance extended to wiretaps, informants, and psychological pressure. In 1964, the FBI sent King an anonymous letter widely interpreted as an attempt to coerce him into suicide. The letter warned that his filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self would soon be exposed. This act would later become one of the most cited examples of COINTELPRO's moral boundaries being crossed. Media coverage at the time often focused on unrest rather than cause. Televised images of protests emphasized disorder, reinforcing official claims that radical movements threatened stability. Rarely did mainstream outlets question the legality of federal surveillance. The Black Panther Party soon became another major target. Internal memos labeled it the greatest threat to internal security of the country. COINTELPRO sought to exacerbate internal divisions, spread false information, and provoke conflicts between rival groups. Informants were encouraged to create suspicion from within. Fake letters, forged documents, and manipulated rumors became standard tools. These tactics did not merely observe movements, they actively reshaped them. Other groups followed: anti-Vietnam War organizations, socialist collectives, student movements, and feminist activists. The criteria for targeting became increasingly broad, often based on ideology rather than evidence of criminal activity. By the mid-1960s, COINTELPRO had become less a counterintelligence program and more a mechanism of political control. Its reach extended far beyond its original mandate, and its operations grew increasingly aggressive. Yet despite its scale, the program remained invisible to the public, protected by secrecy, bureaucratic fragmentation, and a media landscape largely deferential to authority during times of national tension. By the late 1960s, cracks began to form in COINTELPRO's secrecy. The Vietnam War eroded public trust, investigative journalism gained momentum, and skepticism towards government authority grew louder. The conditions that had allowed the program to operate unnoticed were beginning to shift. In 1971, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole classified files and anonymously mailed them to journalists and members of Congress. Among the documents were references to COINTELPRO. Initially, the FBI dismissed the revelations, but as journalists began connecting patterns, the scope of the program became undeniable. Headlines shifted from fear of radicals to concern over government overreach. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 would later formalize what many suspected. Senator Frank Church famously warned that intelligence powers could enable total tyranny if left unchecked. The committee concluded that COINTELPRO violated constitutional rights and lacked meaningful oversight. Media coverage played a dual role during this period. While early reporting had often echoed official narratives, investigative journalists now reframed the story, not as national defense, but as abuse of power. COINTELPRO was officially terminated in 1971. New guidelines were introduced to limit domestic surveillance. Intelligence agencies pledged reform, transparency, and accountability. Yet the legacy of COINTELPRO did not end with its closure. Many activists reported long-term psychological and organizational damage. Trust within movements had been eroded, sometimes permanently. Public debate shifted towards a broader question: how much secrecy is compatible with democracy? The answer remains unresolved. COINTELPRO became a case study in the dangers of unchecked authority, a reminder that the line between protection and repression is often defined only after it has been crossed.